All right, let's skip the warm-ups and dive right into this explainer. Because, the history of video games, it's not just some fun little story about kids' toys. No, it is a relentless, chaotic cycle of groundbreaking creation, billions of dollars, and catastrophic corporate hubris. We're talking about massive companies rising to absolute dominance and then literally collapsing in the span of just a few years. It's wild. Let's get right into it.
Now, you might naturally think that gaming started with, simple arcade novelties or wooden board games, but its origins are actually tied to something much heavier. It all started with the exact same minds that built the atomic bomb and cracked World War II codes. Seriously.
So we jump straight from massive government mainframes calculating global warfare to 1958. This is when William Higginbotham, an actual Manhattan Project scientist, by the way, created a side-on simulation called Tennis for Two. He was literally just trying to make an interactive display using an analog computer. But by 1972, this wild concept gets commercialized. A brand new company named Atari steps onto the scene and releases Pong.
And when Pong hit arcades, revenues didn't just grow, they absolutely hockey-sticked to an absurd $35 million in an incredibly short amount of time. Suddenly, every corporate suit realized that these bouncing digital pixels were an absolute goldmine.
The game was so incredibly popular that the very first Pong machine installed in a local venue completely broke down. And the funny thing is, when Atari was called out to fix it, they discovered it wasn't a software glitch at all. No, the machine jammed purely because the physical weight and volume of all those quarters stuffed inside had overflowed the cash box. Video games had officially arrived.
Section 1. Hubris and the landfill.
You see, explosive growth always breeds explosive arrogance, and Atari was about to learn a very, very expensive lesson in corporate reality. By 1982, they're raking in $1.7 billion in operating profit. And sure, they were famous for being this party company with a totally relaxed office culture, but then corporate suits from their parent company took over. They completely alienated the very programmers making their multi-million-dollar hits. They famously refused them royalties, telling these brilliant engineers that they were no more important than assembly line workers. This literally led their best talent to just walk out and form Activision.
This toxic arrogance really culminated in 1982. Atari paid an absolute fortune for the license to the movie E.T. and rushed out a terrible game just to hit the holiday season. They gave the developer only a few months to make it, completely skipped audience testing, and blindly manufactured 5 million cartridges. They basically just assumed people would buy whatever had the Atari logo stamped on it.
Well, they were dead wrong. The market became totally saturated with absolute garbage, with dozens of companies rushing out terrible games just to make a quick buck. This caused the infamous 1983 video game crash. Home revenues plummeted from $3.2 billion down to just $100 million by 1985. That is an unfathomable 97% drop. The golden age ended abruptly. Investors panicked. Companies went totally bankrupt, and Atari was sold off for almost nothing. And those unsold ET cartridges? Hundreds of thousands of them, along with other games, were literally dumped into a New Mexico landfill and buried under a layer of concrete. Actual corporate trash just buried out in the desert. At this point, everyone in America thought video games were just a dead fad.
Section 2. Nintendo's Trojan Horse.
Over in Japan, a totally different story was unfolding. With America convinced that gaming was dead, a 100-year-old Japanese playing card company had to figure out a way to trick US retailers into selling a console. And Nintendo was brilliant here. They essentially Trojan horsed their system into American living rooms by pretending it wasn't a video game console at all. They designed the NES to look exactly like a VCR, complete with that little front-loading flap. They refused to call the games cartridges, instead branding them as game packs, and they bundled the whole thing with a light gun and a plastic robot named ROB, marketing the entire package as a futuristic toy and a home entertainment hub.
Nintendo knew they had to prevent another Atari-style crash, so they introduced the golden Nintendo seal of quality. Now, to you and me, the consumers, it meant the game wouldn't be broken garbage. But functionally, behind the scenes, it was a mechanism for total control. It allowed Nintendo to exert absolute, iron-fisted control over what third-party developers could and couldn't publish. They essentially monopolized the entire market.
Section 3. Sega's Blast Processing War. Nintendo pretty much ruled the world unopposed, until their monopoly was challenged by an arcade heavyweight named Sega. Sega realized that the best way to fight a family-friendly giant was to take the gloves off and play dirty. While Nintendo was strictly family-friendly, even censoring the blood out of Mortal Kombat, Sega went the exact opposite route. They marketed their Genesis console as the edgy, mature alternative. They boasted about their faster blast processor, which, fun fact, was a completely made-up marketing term. And they deliberately leaned into the controversy, leaving all the bloody fatalities right there in Mortal Kombat for teenagers to enjoy.
They launched one of the most aggressive kinetic marketing campaigns in history, built entirely around the absolute legendary slogan, "Sega does what Nintendo don't." And you know what? It worked brilliantly. By giving off this cool, rebellious energy and launching Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega snatched a massive 65% market share in the US. They completely humiliated Nintendo in their most profitable market.
But all that blood and edgy marketing caused a massive moral panic in America. Things got so incredibly heated that by late 1993, executives from these two bitter rivals were forced to sit right next to each other in front of a U.S. congressional hearing. Instead of defending the industry together, they just sat there pointing fingers at each other over violent games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. This, ultimately, is what led to the creation of the ESRB age rating system we have today.
Section 4. The $299 mic drop.
As the 90s wore on, we shifted from 2D sprites into the 3D polygon era, and corporate warfare reached absolute peak pettiness. Sega was terrified of a new competitor entering the market, so they tried to pull off an ambush. At the very first E3 in 1995, Sega shocked the world by announcing that their new 32-bit console, the Saturn, was launching immediately, like that very day. 4 months early, and for a pretty hefty $399. But the stunt backfired horrifically. They completely alienated retailers who had zero stock, and the console launched with barely any games actually ready to play.
Immediately following Sega's disastrous, fumbled announcement, a man named Steve Race, an executive for a brand new gaming division at Sony, walked up to the E3 podium. He didn't give a grand speech. He just leaned into the microphone, uttered a single, devastating number, $299, and walked straight off the stage.
That legendary mic drop instantly killed the Sega Saturn's momentum. Sony undercut them by $100 right out of the gate, and when the PlayStation actually launched later that year, it sold more units in its first 2 days than the Sega Saturn had managed to sell in 4 entire months. It was an absolute massacre, marking the beginning of Sony's complete dominance.
But Sony didn't just win on price alone. They won because they built a system that game developers actually wanted to use. Unlike Sega and Nintendo, who stuck to expensive, difficult hardware and proprietary cartridges, Sony embraced cheap, efficient, PC-based development kits. They used massive capacity CD-ROMs. They welcomed third-party developers with open arms, proving once and for all that the studios making the games now completely controlled the industry's fate. And the results? Totally staggering. The original PlayStation went on to become the very first console in history to sell over 100 million units. It completely cemented a new era where business strategy, marketing, and developer relations mattered just as much as raw game design.
So, as this explainer shows, the cycle of incredible, boundary-pushing innovation, followed by brutal corporate destruction, is quite literally baked into gaming's DNA. From physicists hacking military computers, to deserts full of plastic trash, to executives fighting on stage at E3, it leaves us all to wonder. With the massive budgets, monetization, and corporate bloat we see today, when and where will the next great reset hit? Keep that in mind the next time you boot up your favorite game. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.